Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you all can hear me right now. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is our 5th webinar and actually marks our halfway point in our fiscal training webinar series. And today's presentation, we will be talking about the preschool reserve account. So this webinar this morning is being presented by the California Department of Education, Early Education and Nutrition Fiscal Services Unit of the Fiscal and Administrative Services Division. So we often call ourselves EENFS for short. So for those that do not know me, my name is Corey Kahn, and I am the manager over the EENFS unit. And today I am joined by all the EENFS fiscal analysts and managers. We also have some of our friends from the Early Education Division joining us, and that they will be all available to help answer questions throughout this presentation. So note that we have disabled the chat box for participants as we have in all of our past webinars, although EENFS staff may be using this feature throughout the presentation to share links with you all. And our team is committed to being as responsive as possible, but will most likely not be able to answer every question. So we ask that you please utilize the Q&A feature to ask us questions and give us as much detail as possible before clicking that submit button. And at the end of this presentation, Alan Lynch will be facilitating a live Q&A session where he'll go over some frequently asked questions that have come through the chat or the Q&A feature throughout the session, or it's the opportunity where we will call on those participants who have their hand raised. So if we aren't able to get through all the questions, we'll take them back and try to reach out to you later, or we may use them for developing a frequently asked questions page on our website. We do ask that when you do submit your question through the Q&A, that you include some identifying information, such as your vendor number or agency, just in the body of the Q&A. So that will allow us to track questions that have come through and follow up with you in case we didn't get to your question. Okay, so before we get started, as I've announced in past webinars, I do want to take another moment to say that we do have a web page dedicated for posting these fiscal trainings and webinars. So our office has been recording these webinars as we are today, in hopes of posting them to our website. So one of our team members, Jenny Tran, has been diligently working on transcribing these past webinars. To date, we still only have our first webinar posted, and so anyone can go view that webinar. That was on the enrollment, attendance, and fiscal reporting requirements. So this is the web page, so it can be found at www.cde.ga/SG/CD/webinars and trainings.asp. So Jenny, I think, will be posting that into the chat. So navigating to this page, you'll find a table with 3 columns that identifies the date in which the webinar took place, the link to the recording, and a summary of the training topics that we covered. So for example, the first webinar of this training was conducted on November 13th, 2024. It was titled Enrollment, Attendance, and Fiscal Reporting Requirements. And the topics we went over were reporting requirements, enrollment and attendance source documentation, and revenue and expense source documentation. So we will continue to be recording these webinars, and then we will post them to this table as they become available. So I would highly recommend that you just go there periodically to see if there have been more posted. So now I'm going to turn it over to your presenters this morning. It is Samira Wiggins and Morgan Liefel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Samira Wiggins. Thank you, Corey. And I'm a fiscal analyst with the Department of Education. I will be presenting today with my colleague, Morgan Leffel. This morning, we will discuss what a preschool reserve account is, how to establish and maintain a preschool reserve account, reporting requirements, activity and status reports in CPARES, transfers to and from a preschool reserve account, and lastly, when to utilize funds from a preschool reserve account. So first, what is a preschool reserve account? A preschool reserve account is an account held and maintained by a California State Preschool Program, CSPP, contractor. Contractors are not required to maintain a preschool reserve account, but are encouraged to develop and maintain one while following specific requirements, which we will go into more detail throughout this presentation. Preschool reserve account funds are state funds that the contractor holds in reserve as deferred revenue until they are either properly spent or returned to CDE. Preschool reserve account funds become a supplemental source of state dollars available when reimbursable costs exceed contract reimbursement. California Education Code EC Section 8336A states that all early education contractors are encouraged to develop and maintain a reserve within the Child Development Fund, derived from earned but unexpended funds. Early education contractors may retain all earned funds. For purposes of this section, earned funds are those for which the required number of eligible service units have been provided. Contractors earn funds providing services to children. Contractors may be able to retain funds in a reserve account when they provide services to children while keeping program costs low. Later, I will give some scenarios on how reserve account transfers are calculated. There is a limit on the amount of funds that can be retained in a preschool reserve account. Pursuant to EC Section 8336B2, reserve account balances cannot exceed 15% of CSPP contract maximum reimbursable amount or $2,000, whichever is greater. If you do not have a preschool reserve account and want to set one up, you would need to establish a preschool reserve in CPARES by navigating to the Preschool Reserve menu. Then select Establish Reserve Account submenu. To establish a preschool reserve account, the contractor must certify a statement of intent to establish and maintain a preschool reserve account in CPARES. The deadline for submitting a statement of intent to establish and maintain a preschool reserve account is July 20th. Let's take a look at this on the next slide. Here is a statement of intent to establish and maintain a preschool reserve account in CPARES. The contractor must agree to the conditions associated with having a preschool reserve account by checking the box and certifying the statement of intent. These include keeping reserve account funds in an interest-bearing account within the contractor's early education fund, agreeing to submit a preschool reserve activity report and a copy of the general ledger annually with the June year-end enrollment attendance and fiscal report. Transfers from a preschool reserve account shall be for reimbursable expenses for certified children. Agreeing that funding amounts to be reserved are derived from earned but unexpended contract funds and are calculated by the CDE during the year-end closure of each year's contract. Support contract funds are not eligible to be reserved. So if your agency currently doesn't have a preschool reserve account and is interested in setting one up for fiscal year 24-25, you would need to submit the intent statement in CPARES along with your June report prior to the July 20th deadline. Please note that establishing a reserve account only lets the CDE know that your agency wishes to establish and maintain a preschool reserve account. The CDE does not open an account or maintain the account on behalf of the contractor. It is the contractor's responsibility to have an interest-bearing account established where they will transfer funds into when a transfer is calculated by the CDE. So now we'll talk about how to maintain a preschool reserve account. As I just went over, contractors who have a preschool reserve account agree to keep reserve funds in an interest-bearing account, and any interest earned on reserve funds must be included in the fund balance. LEAs, reserve accounts must be held in a Child Development Fund, Fund 12, Standardized Account Code Resource 6130. Reserve account funds do not need to be in a separate bank account from the Child Development Fund or from a center-based reserve fund if applicable, but contractors must have a way to identify the funds associated with the preschool reserve account. As a reminder, the reserve account cap is 15% of the sum of the original contract MRAs that contribute to the reserve account. If your agency participated in a voluntary temporary transfer or intra-agency transfer, the preschool reserve cap is not impacted by any transfer to or from the CSPP contract. For example, if your agency temporarily received $100,000 via an intra-agency transfer, also known as a VTT, that amount would not be included in determining the reserve cap. Reporting requirements for preschool reserve. All contractors that hold a preschool reserve account are required to submit an annual preschool reserve account activity report in CPARES by July 20th. If a preschool reserve account has a balance greater than zero, a copy of the preschool reserve general ledger, also known as the GL, verifying the interests and balances maintained in the preschool reserve account must be emailed to the fiscal analyst. If the preschool reserve account activity report and GL, if applicable, are not received by the July 20th deadline, all year-end reports will be considered delinquent. So even if you submit your enrollment attendance and fiscal report on time, it will be considered delinquent if a reserve account activity report is not submitted by the deadline. This is because when contractors have a preschool reserve account, the fiscal analyst must process it with your June year-end enrollment attendance and fiscal report, as it determines whether funds should be transferred into the reserve account. As such, the fiscal analyst cannot process the June year-end enrollment attendance and fiscal report without the required, without the required reserve account documents. The GLs must show interest earned being deposited into the reserve account. Interest on the GL needs to match the interest reported on the activity report. The ending balance reported must align with the reserve activity report. If the reserve account has a zero balance, a GL is not required. However, contractors still need to submit the preschool reserve activity reports. Now let's go over where to find preschool reserve account activity reports in CPARES. Once logged into CPARIS, users can navigate the Preschool Reserve menu. Then clicking on the Reserve Account Reports submenu will take you to the list of Preschool Reserve Account reports. From this page, you can search by year if needed. You can find the Preschool Reserve Account activity reports within the list here. Once your fiscal analyst reviews and approves the year-end reports, the Preschool Reserve Account status report will become viewable here. If you are a non-LEA, also known as a private agency, you will also see the audited Preschool Reserve Account reports after the audit has been processed by your fiscal analyst. The June preschool status report becomes approved obsolete once an audit is calculated. Here is an example of a Preschool Reserve Account activity report. Remember, the Preschool Reserve Account activity report is the report that is submitted annually by contractors. We will go over how contractors complete this activity report. First, we have the beginning balance. The beginning balance will auto-populate from last fiscal year's ending balance. For this example, we have $40,000. The next field is titled Interest Earned on Reserve Account Funds. The contractor must enter the interest earned on preschool reserve funds on this line. In this example, the contractor entered $5. The next two lines of the report relate to the amount of funds you, the contractor, want to transfer from your reserve to cover any reimbursable costs that exceed contract reimbursement. These lines are titled Transfer from Reserve Account to CSPP Agreements and Agreements Receiving Funds from Reserve Accounts. You will utilize these two lines when your agency overspent and you have a reserve account balance that can be used as revenue to cover these costs. In this example, the contractor had no transfers from their reserve account to cover CSPP expenses. If there were any transfers from the reserve account to CSPP, they will be reflected here, and I will go over an example in a future slide. Using the information provided, CPARIS will calculate the ending balance of the preschool reserve. In this example, we have $40,005. Here is an example of the preschool reserve account status report. The preschool reserve account status report is the report that becomes viewable once the fiscal analyst reviews and approves your June year-end enrollment, attendance, and fiscal report and reserve account activity report. The first line of the report shows the maximum preschool reserve amount. Remember, Education Code Section 8336B2 limits reserve accounts to 15% of CSPP contracts maximum reimbursable amount, or $2,000, whichever is greater. In this example, the maximum preschool reserve amount is $75,000. Next, you will see the beginning balance, which is last fiscal year's ending balance. In this example, it is $40,000. You will then see the reported interest. If you remember from the previous slide, the reported interest was $5. Any identified transfers from the reserve to the CSPP contract will be found on the next line from the reserve account activity report from the previous slide. There were no transfers from the reserve to a CSPP contract. Also, on this line, you will find any calculated transfers into the reserve. Transfers into the reserve are always calculated by the CDE based on the contractor's CSPP earnings. Remember, contractors may be directed to transfer funds into the reserve account when they provide services to children while keeping program costs low. In this example, there were no calculated transfers into the reserve account. Then there is the ending balance, beginning balance plus or minus any transfers plus interest, which in this case is $40,005. Lastly, if there is any excess to be billed, meaning the reserve ending balance exceeds the reserve amount cap, the ending balance after the excess billing would be shown here. Morgan will now take over the presentation. She will show examples of transfers within the reserve during her portion of this presentation.
Thank you, Samira, and good morning, everyone. My name is Morgan Leffel, and I'm a fiscal analyst with the Department of Education. So now that we have covered what the preschool reserve account is and how to maintain one, let's transition into how and when funds can be transferred to and from the preschool reserve account. So first, how do funds transfer into the reserve account? A transfer to the reserve will be indicated when reimbursable service earnings exceed reimbursable costs based on the June year-end report. The amount a contract may reserve is its reimbursable service earnings minus reimbursable costs, not to exceed the contract MRA and capped at the reserve account maximum limit. Let's take a look at an example. So in this example, reimbursable service earnings are $500,000, reimbursable costs are $475,000, and the MRA is $500,000. So here, the amount able to be transferred to the reserve is $25,000. Please note, if the agency in this example did not have a reserve account, they would only be reimbursed for their reimbursable costs of $475,000. But because they do have a reserve, the total earnings equate to $500,000, with $475,000 for reimbursable costs and $25,000 going into the reserve for future use. Because contractors can use these funds in subsequent years, it's encouraged for contractors to establish a reserve account. Over the next couple of slides, I'm going to show where this $25,000 transfer to the reserve can be found on the correspondence received from EENFS. When a transfer to the reserve occurs, you will see the transfer on the line titled Transfer to Preschool Reserve on the Contract Earnings Calculation Worksheet. Local educational agencies, or LEAs, should refer to the contract earnings calculation generated from the most recent June year-end enrollment, attendance, and physical report, while non-LEAs would refer to the audited contract earnings calculation. As calculated on the previous slide, the contractor is required to place the identified transfer amount of $25,000 into their reserve account using revenue received from their CSPP contract apportionment payments. Any identified transfer to the reserve account can also be found on the preschool reserve account status report on the line titled Transfer to the Preschool Reserve. Again, for this example, the calculated transfer was $25,000. As previously shown at the top of the reserve account status report, we have the maximum preschool reserve amount of $75,000, beginning balance of $40,000, and $5 of reported interest. The middle section, again, calculates the transfer to and from the reserve account. And the last section displays the ending balance. So we have $40,000 plus $5 plus $25,000 equals $65,005. Because the reserve ending balance of $65,005 is less than the maximum reserve amount, there is no calculated excess reserve to be billed. So now that this contractor has reserve funds, let's talk about when the contractor could utilize these reserve funds. A transfer from the reserve might be necessary when reimbursable costs exceed the contract MRA. For example, if in a future year the contractor's reimbursable costs were $525,000 with an MRA of $500,000, then the contractor would be over-earning their contract. In this example, contract reimbursements would be capped at the MRA of $500,000, and thus the contractor has overspent their contract by $25,000. To cover the $25,000 not otherwise reimbursed by the CSPP contract, the contractor could utilize funding from their reserve account. In this example, they would transfer $25,000 from their reserve account to the CSPP contract. When transferring funds from your reserve to a preschool contract, your agency must report the transfer on the fiscal section of the enrollment, attendance, and physical report in CPARAS. We'll show you an example shortly. Ed Code section 8336B1 states that earned but unexpected funds shall remain in the contractor's reserve account within the Child Development Fund and shall be expended only by programs that are funded under contract with the department. Preschool reserve account funds can only be used for reimbursable program expenses for eligible children that exceed contract reimbursement and transferred to preschool contracts. Preschool reserve account funds cannot be used in the same fiscal year in which they are earned or to satisfy CSPP contract billings. As mentioned earlier, if your agency were to earn reserve funds in fiscal year 23-24, those funds could only be used in subsequent years. Now let's talk about how to report a transfer from the reserve account to the preschool contract. Transferring of funds from the preschool reserve account to the contract is allowable when reimbursable expenses are greater than the contract MRA. We will use the same example from the previous slide with the agency having $525,000 in reimbursable costs with the MRA of $500,000 and only being reimbursed up to the MRA of $500,000. In this example, the agency had $25,000 in excess expenses that they are not getting reimbursed for based on their MRA. Because the agency's reimbursement won't cover the excess, a transfer from the reserve account would be necessary to cover the costs. When using reserve account funds to cover excess expenses, contractors must report the transfer as revenue on the June year-end enrollment, attendance, and physical report in the revenue section on the line transfer from the preschool reserve account. The amount reported on the enrollment, attendance, and physical report will automatically be reflected on the preschool reserve account activity report, which again is due with the June report. Here is an example of a preschool reserve account activity report. As mentioned before, the beginning balance will be on the top line. If you remember the example on how funds transfer to the reserve account, the ending balance was $65,005. This becomes the beginning balance on the subsequent fiscal year's reserve account activity report. The interest reported by the contractor was again $5. CPARAS will automatically import the transfer from the fiscal page of the enrollment, attendance, and physical report on the transfer from reserve account to CSPP agreements line. So as we calculated, the contractor needed to use $25,000 from their reserve to cover their excess costs not otherwise reimbursed by the CSPP contract. When there is an amount on the transfer from the reserve account to CSPP agreement line, the contractor must identify the contract number on the line titled Agreements Receiving Funds from Reserve Account. Lastly, the report calculates the ending balance by taking the $65,005 plus $5 minus $25,000 in the transfer to equal $40,010. Once all year-end reports have been submitted and an acceptable GL is emailed to your fiscal analyst, we can approve both the June year-end enrollment, attendance, and fiscal report and the preschool reserve account activity report. As a result, the contract earnings calculation will be generated and the contractor can see that the transfer from the reserve will show up on the line Transfer from Preschool Reserve Account. The contract earnings calculation subtracts the $25,000 from your total reimbursable expenses to bring the net reimbursable expenses line in line with the MRA of $500,000. For non-LEAs, the final amount will be reflected on the audited reserve account activity and status reports. Finally, the transfer from the preschool reserve will also be reflected on the preschool reserve account status report. The $25,000 transfer from the reserve is being subtracted from the beginning balance plus the interest to get the ending balance of $40,010. This will be the beginning balance for the next fiscal year. Thank you for joining us for the webinar today. We'll be happy to take your questions and address some of the questions in the chat now. For general questions on the reserve account, please be sure to reference our fiscal handbook beginning on page 88 or contact your fiscal analyst.